where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
Here's something nobody tells you about being told you're not enough. Sometimes it's the most liberating sentence you'll ever hear. Think about it. What if everything you've been taught about your worth, about what makes you valuable in society's eyes, is actually a carefully constructed lie designed to keep you playing a game you were never meant to win? Lady Mary grew up hearing one message repeated like a curse. You'll never marry without a dowry. Society whispered it, her relatives murmured it, even well-meaning friends suggested it with sympathetic smiles. She was supposed to accept this prophecy, fade into obscurity, maybe become some wealthy family's governess or companion. A half-life lived in the shadows of other people's happiness. But here's the paradox that'll make you question everything. The wealthiest duke in England, the man every family with a fortune wanted to capture, fell desperately in love with her precisely because she had nothing to offer except herself. How does that happen? How does someone society has written off as worthless become irresistible to someone who could have anyone? The answer involves secrets buried for decades, conspiracies that reach into the highest levels of power, and a mystery so dangerous that people have been murdered to keep it silent. This isn't just a love story, though it is that, and a remarkable one. This is about discovering that the rules you've been following were designed to control you, that the limitations placed on your life were never about your actual capabilities, and that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to believe the lies everyone keeps telling you about who you're supposed to be. What if the dowry they said you needed was never the real requirement? What if what actually matters, in love, in life, in everything, has been hidden from you your whole life, kept as a hidden secret by people who benefit from your ignorance? Lady Mary's journey from ridiculed outcast to the center of a revolution will show you exactly what happens when you stop playing by rules that were rigged against you from the start. And fair warning, once you see how the game actually works, you can never unsee it. Your own life might start looking very different, and the forbidden questions you've been afraid to ask might suddenly demand answers. Ready to discover what they've been hiding? Let's begin where all great revelations start, with someone brave enough to say no when everyone else is nodding along to comfortable lies. Listen, there's something they don't tell you about society's whispers. They're designed to keep you exactly where you are. Lady Mary had grown accustomed to the silence that followed her entrance into every ballroom. That peculiar hush that wasn't quite respect, but something far more sinister. Without a dowry, she was practically invisible, a ghost wandering through gilded halls where everyone else seemed to carry the secret password to acceptance. The other young women would exchange knowing glances, their eyes speaking a language Mary had learned to decode over countless humiliating seasons. It's funny how money, or the lack of it, can turn you into a walking enigma, someone people can't quite figure out how to treat. She'd become an expert at reading the traces of pity in people's smiles, those tiny vestiges that revealed what they truly thought. You see, in a world where your value's measured by gold coins and property deeds, being penniless wasn't just inconvenient, it was a form of social death. The conspiracy against her wasn't hidden. It was performed in plain sight, like a theatrical production where everyone knew their lines except her. At Lady Ashford's garden party, Mary overheard two countesses discussing her unfortunate situation, with the kind of fascinated horror usually reserved for natural disasters. "Poor dear," one had whispered, though her tone dripped with something closer to satisfaction than sympathy. "She'll never marry without a dowry. It's simply forbidden by good sense." The other had nodded sagely, adding that Mary should perhaps consider becoming a governess or heaven forbid, a companion to some elderly aunt in the countryside. These weren't just casual observations. They were prophecies meant to become self-fulfilling, coded messages that said, "Know your place." Mary felt something twist inside her chest. Not quite anger, not quite despair, but a volatile mixture of both. She'd learned that society's cruelest weapon isn't the sword, but the carefully placed word. The suggestion that your dreams are laughable because you lack the proper credentials. Now, here's where most stories would have you believe that Mary simply accepted her fate, retreated into obscurity, and lived out her days in quiet desperation. But that's not how this tale unfolds, because Mary possessed something far more valuable than gold. She had genuine curiosity about the world beyond ballrooms and dowries. While other young ladies spent their afternoons practicing needlepoint and gossip, Mary would disappear into her late father's library, devouring books on philosophy, astronomy, and even economics. She'd read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and found herself arguing with the text, scribbling notes in the margins about what the man had gotten wrong about value and worth. Her mind worked differently, you see. She could find patterns where others saw only chaos, could solve mathematical puzzles that would make grown men scratch their heads in confusion. This wasn't just idle hobby. It was her secret rebellion, her way of building something they couldn't take away or ridicule. Knowledge became her hidden treasure, the gift she carried with her everywhere. The conflict within Mary was constant and exhausting. Part of her desperately wanted to belong, to be accepted by the very people who mocked her circumstances. She'd stand before her mirror, practicing smiles and graceful curtsies, trying to perfect the art of seeming untroubled by their cruel whispers. But another part, the part that had been fed by countless books and revolutionary ideas, questioned why she should even want their approval. Wasn't their world built on shallow foundations? Weren't they the ones trapped, following rules they'd never examined or questioned? It's like being stuck between two rooms, one filled with people who'll never truly see you, and another that's empty but honest. She'd attend every social function with a brave face, knowing she was essentially performing a role in a play where the ending had already been written. Yet, something inside her refused to accept that script. There were nights when she'd lie awake, wondering if she should simply stop trying, disappear into that predicted life of quiet desperation they'd mapped out for her. The revelation came to her slowly, like dawn breaking after an impossibly long night. Mary realized that she'd been playing their game with their rules, and of course, she was losing. The game was rigged from the start. What if she stopped trying to fit into their narrow definitions of worthiness? What if her lack of dowry wasn't a deficiency, but simply a different starting point? She began to see her situation not as a prison, but as a kind of freedom. She had nothing to lose, which meant she could risk everything. This shift in perspective didn't erase the pain of exclusion, but it transformed it into something else, something almost like fuel. She started speaking her mind more freely at social gatherings, discussing ideas that made the other guests uncomfortable. When Lord Pemberton pontificated about the natural order of society, Mary politely challenged him with questions he couldn't answer, exposing the flimsy logic behind his grand pronouncements. She wasn't being rude, she was simply refusing to pretend anymore. And here's the paradox. The more she stopped trying to please everyone, the more interesting she became to certain observant eyes. The Duke of Ravenswood was exactly the kind of man society expected to marry a fortune, not a philosophy. He was wealthy beyond measure, with estates sprawling across 3 counties and connections that reached into the highest echelons of power. His family's history was written in the architecture of castles and the signatures on treaties that had shaped the nation. Everyone assumed he'd marry Lady Victoria Ashford, whose dowry could probably fund a small army, and whose pedigree was so pure it was practically boring. The courtship seemed inevitable, predictable, almost contractually obligated by the unwritten laws of their class. But the Duke had grown weary of predictability, tired of conversations that went exactly where you knew they'd go, exhausted by the performance of aristocratic life. He'd been to war, seen men die for meaningless conflicts, and returned home questioning everything he'd once taken for granted. When he looked around at his peers, he saw people trapped in amber, preserved but not really living. He wanted something real, something that would wake him up from this gilded stupor, though he couldn't quite articulate what that something might be. Their first real conversation happened almost by accident, at a ball where Mary had resigned herself to another evening of invisibility. The Duke had escaped to the library, the one place he knew would be deserted during a party, seeking temporary refuge from yet another ambitious mother parading her daughter before him. He found Mary there, completely absorbed in a book about celestial navigation, her finger tracing the path of constellations across a star chart. "Do you sail?" he'd asked, genuinely curious about why a young woman would be studying such a practical subject. She'd looked up, startled, and for a moment he saw something flash across her face. Not the calculated charm he was used to, but something more like annoyance at being interrupted. "No," she'd replied honestly, "but I find it fascinating that humans once crossed entire oceans, using only the stars as their guide. Imagine trusting your life to patterns of light millions of miles away." Her answer surprised him. Most people would have made some flirtatious comment or deferred to his presumed greater knowledge. Instead, she'd shared a genuine thought, offered him a glimpse of how her mind worked. They talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing, and he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Intellectual excitement, mixed with an inexplicable sense of coming home. What the Duke didn't know yet, what would only become clear as their unlikely connection deepened, was that Mary carried secrets of her own, mysteries that would challenge everything he thought he understood about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of wealth. Her past held vestiges of a lost fortune, whispered stories about her father's disappearance, and what might have happened to the family's money. There were those who believed Lord Edmund hadn't simply died poor. They suspected something far more intriguing, something involving codes in his journals and investments that had vanished without explanation. But those mysteries would have to wait for now, because something was shifting in the ballroom. A subtle change in the social atmosphere that both Mary and the Duke were only beginning to sense. You know what's fascinating about social scandals? They don't explode all at once. They simmer, building pressure until the inevitable eruption that everyone claims they never saw coming. The morning after that library conversation, the Duke did something unprecedented. He called upon Mary at her modest townhouse, arriving in his grand carriage that seemed almost obscenely luxurious, parked outside her humble door. Word spread through London's social circles faster than wildfire, whispers carrying the news from drawing room to drawing room like a contagion. "He visited her," the matrons gasped, their fans fluttering with scandalized delight. "Without a chaperone present the entire time," another added, though that detail was entirely fabricated. The truth didn't matter much in their world. Perception was everything. And the perception was that something forbidden was unfolding. Mary found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't asked for, suddenly visible in ways that made her previous invisibility seem like a blessing. The enigma of the Duke's interest became the season's most captivating mystery, dissected and analyzed in every fashionable salon. The conspiracy theories multiplied like rabbits. Some whispered that Mary must have employed dark arts or ancient seduction techniques passed down through generations of cunning women. Others suggested she possessed some secret leverage over the Duke, perhaps knowledge of a hidden scandal that could ruin his reputation. Lady Pemberton, whose own daughter had failed to catch the Duke's eye, started a particularly vicious rumor about Mary's mother having been a French courtesan who'd taught her daughter continental tricks for ensnaring wealthy men. It's almost comical how people will construct elaborate narratives to explain away something that challenges their worldview. The simple possibility that the Duke might genuinely enjoy Mary's company was apparently too threatening to consider. These weren't just idle gossips. They were people protecting their understanding of how the world should work. If a penniless nobody could capture the most eligible bachelor's attention through mere conversation and authentic connection, what did that say about all the dowries and bloodlines they'd spent their lives valuing? The hidden motivation behind their cruelty was fear. Fear that their entire social structure might be more fragile than they'd believed. Now, the Duke wasn't oblivious to the whispers, but here's what separated him from his peers. He'd learned in war that popular opinion is often spectacularly wrong. He'd watched generals make decisions based on conventional wisdom that got thousands of men killed, had seen obvious truths revealed as comfortable lies. So, when his mother summoned him for a serious discussion about his inappropriate fascination with Lady Mary, he arrived prepared for battle. "She has no dowry, no connections, no prospects," his mother stated, ticking off Mary's deficiencies like items on a shopping list. "What she has," he replied calmly, "is a mind that challenges mine, authenticity in a world drowning in performance, and the courage to be herself, despite knowing how harshly she'll be judged for it." His mother had stared at him as if he'd started speaking in tongues. "You cannot be serious about pursuing this," she'd pressed, her voice carrying that edge of desperation mothers get when they sense their children slipping beyond their control. "I've never been more serious about anything," he'd answered, and in that moment, a silent conflict was declared. Family loyalty versus personal truth, tradition versus transformation. The revelation of the Duke's intentions hit society like a meteor strike. At the Beaumont Ball, the most prestigious event of the season, he did the unthinkable. He danced the first waltz exclusively with Mary, ignoring every other eligible young lady waiting expectantly along the walls. But it wasn't just that he danced with her. It was how he looked at her, as if she were the only person in a room packed with hundreds. He laughed openly at something she said, his face animated in a way none of them had seen before. Lady Victoria Ashford, the presumed bride-to-be, stood frozen with her practiced smile, cracking like porcelain, while her mother looked ready to commit murder right there on the ballroom floor. The orchestra seemed to play louder, or maybe everyone else had simply fallen into stunned silence, watching this impossible scene unfold. When the dance ended, instead of moving on to his obligatory rotation through the other young ladies, the Duke remained at Mary's side for the entire evening. He'd essentially announced his interest in the most public way possible, breaking every unwritten rule about courtship and propriety. The message was clear. He wasn't playing by their rules anymore. Here's where things get interesting, though, because Mary wasn't entirely comfortable with this sudden spotlight either. She'd spent so long being invisible that becoming the center of attention felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. The other young women now looked at her with undisguised hatred. Their earlier dismissive pity transformed into something far more dangerous. She received anonymous letters, some threatening, others pleading with her to do the decent thing and step aside for someone more worthy. One note contained just 2 words: "No silence," a cryptic warning that sent chills down her spine. Was someone telling her to keep quiet about something, or threatening her to disappear quietly? She showed the letters to her aunt, the only family she had left, who immediately wanted to involve the authorities. But Mary hesitated. partly because she didn't want to seem weak or frightened, and partly because something about the notes suggested a complexity she didn't yet understand. They felt less like random cruelty and more like pieces of a larger puzzle, vestiges of some deeper game being played around her. The conflict wasn't just external anymore. It had burrowed inside her, making her question everything. The Duke noticed the change in Mary during their next meeting. She seemed distracted, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. When he asked what troubled her, she initially deflected, offering some pleasant nonsense about being tired. But he'd learned to read her genuine expressions, could distinguish between her authentic self and the mask she wore for social survival. "Tell me the truth," he'd said gently, and something in his voice, maybe the absence of judgment or demand, unlocked her reticence. She showed him the letters, watched his face darken as he read them. "This is more than jealousy," he said slowly, turning one letter over in his hands as if searching for hidden codes in the paper itself. "This feels coordinated, purposeful." They sat together in her small parlor, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the room, and began to discuss possibilities that seemed increasingly sinister. What if opposition to their relationship wasn't just about social propriety? What if there were people with actual stakes in keeping them apart? Reasons that went beyond wounded pride or disrupted marriage plans? The mystery deepened when the Duke received his own warning, though his came in a more sophisticated package. A gentleman he barely knew approached him at his club, ostensibly to discuss horse racing, but the conversation took a peculiar turn. "These new ideas about marrying for affection rather than advantage," the man had said carefully, "they can be dangerous, not just socially, you understand, but in more concrete ways." When the Duke pressed for clarification, the man had simply smiled and changed the subject, leaving behind only implications and unease. That same evening, his steward reported something odd. Someone had been asking questions about the estate's finances, specifically about certain investments the Duke's father had made years ago. Investments that had mysteriously failed right around the time Mary's father had lost his fortune. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Were their families' histories somehow entangled? Had something happened in the past that people desperately wanted to keep buried? The Duke felt the familiar sensation he'd known in war, the prickle of awareness that comes when you realize you're walking through a minefield. That one wrong step could trigger an explosion you never saw coming. What neither Mary nor the Duke understood yet, what would only reveal itself through painful discoveries and dangerous investigations, was that their connection had awakened something that powerful people had worked hard to keep lost. Somewhere in the intersection of their families' pasts lay a secret so significant that its revelation could shift fortunes, destroy reputations, and rewrite the social order they all took for granted. The disappearance of Mary's father's wealth hadn't been simple misfortune or poor business judgment. It had been orchestrated, deliberate, part of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of society. And now, by falling in love with Mary, the Duke had accidentally stumbled into the middle of it, making himself a target for people who preferred their secrets to remain forever silent. She'd see him hide the journal behind a loose brick in the fireplace, whispering words she could never quite make out through the veil of sleep. Upon waking, she'd dismiss these as mere anxiety manifesting in her subconscious, stress from the social pressure and mysterious threats. But the dreams persisted with such clarity, such specific detail, that she began to wonder if they were actually memories resurfacing, fragments of a night her young mind had tucked away for safekeeping. The enigma of her father's final hours had always haunted her family, but she'd been too young to understand the significance then. Now, standing at the threshold of a new life with the Duke. The past demanded its due. The decision to return to her childhood home took courage Mary didn't know she possessed. The estate had been sold years ago to settle debts, purchased by a merchant family who rarely visited the country property. Through careful inquiry and a small bribe to the caretaker, Mary arranged a private visit, telling no one except her aunt, and certainly not the Duke, who would have insisted on accompanying her and potentially putting himself at further risk. She traveled alone on a gray morning, when London's fog seemed to follow her into the countryside, as if the weather itself conspired to match her mood. Standing before the manor where she'd spent her happiest years felt like confronting a ghost, memories flooding back with painful intensity. The gardens her mother had loved were overgrown now, wild roses climbing walls like they were trying to escape. Inside, the house smelled of disuse and fading grandeur, dust motes dancing in shafts of weak sunlight. Her footsteps echoed through empty halls as she made her way to what had been her father's study, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The study looked smaller than she remembered, the way childhood places always do when revisited through adult eyes. Most of the furniture had been removed, but the fireplace remained, grand, imposing, built from the same stone that had stood for centuries. Mary knelt before it, her fingers trembling as they traced the mortar between bricks, searching for the loose one from her dreams. At first, nothing seemed out of place, and she felt a wave of disappointment mixed with relief. Maybe it had all been fantasy, her mind creating false hope where none existed. But then, high up on the right side, she found it. A brick that shifted slightly under pressure, its edges worn smooth in a way the others weren't. Her breath caught as she carefully worked it free, the scraping sound abnormally loud in the silent room. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, lay her father's journal, exactly as her dreams had shown her. The moment felt surreal, like she'd stepped through a doorway into a reality where impossible things proved true. She pulled the journal free with shaking hands, clutching this forbidden treasure to her chest as tears streamed down her face. This was real. Her father's secrets, preserved through years of silence, waiting for her to find them. Now, you might think Mary would have immediately opened the journal right there, unable to contain her curiosity. But she was smarter than that, more cautious than people gave her credit for. Something whispered that reading it in that house, alone and vulnerable, would be dangerous. That knowledge itself could become a weapon pointed at her throat. So she rewrapped the journal carefully, tucked it deep into her traveling bag beneath layers of clothing, and left the manor with measured steps that betrayed none of her inner turbulence. On the journey back to London, she kept one hand on her bag at all times, hyper-aware of every other passenger in the carriage, every stop along the road. What if someone was watching? What if they knew what she'd found? The paranoia felt justified rather than excessive, especially given the threatening letters and strange warnings. She'd stumbled onto something significant. She could feel it in her bones. That prickle of awareness that comes when you're carrying dynamite disguised as a book. The vestiges of her father's life were about to speak, and she had no idea whether his words would save her or condemn her. Back in London, Mary locked herself in her room and finally opened the journal. Her father's handwriting, elegant, precise, achingly familiar, covered page after page with entries that began as standard business records but evolved into something far more troubling. He'd documented meetings with other nobles, investment schemes that promised extraordinary returns, partnerships sealed with handshakes rather than contracts. But about halfway through, the tone shifted dramatically. He'd discovered something, some pattern in the finances that revealed a massive conspiracy among the highest-ranking families in England. They were manipulating markets, destroying competitors through coordinated attacks, moving money through elaborate networks of shell companies and false fronts. Her father had written about the Duke of Ravenswood's father, the current Duke's predecessor, describing him as one of the few honest men left in this nest of vipers. He'd trusted the old Duke with his discoveries, believing they would expose the corruption together. And then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The final page contained just 3 words in her father's increasingly frantic scrawl. "They know. Run." Mary felt ice flood her veins as the implications crystallized. Her father hadn't died of natural causes at all. He'd been silenced. The revelation changed everything, recontextualizing her entire life story in a single horrifying moment of clarity. Her family's ruin hadn't been unfortunate circumstance or poor judgment. It had been punishment, a warning to others who might consider exposing the conspiracy. They'd stripped her father of everything, destroyed his reputation, and then, what? Killed him? Let him die of the stress and heartbreak? Either way, they'd succeeded in erasing him from history, reducing him to a cautionary tale about financial mismanagement. And now Mary, through her connection with the Duke, had inadvertently painted a target on both their backs. The people who'd silenced her father were still out there, still powerful, still willing to do whatever necessary to protect their secrets. She thought about the anonymous letters, the cryptic warnings, the gentleman at the Duke's Club with his veiled threats. They weren't random acts of jealous aristocrats. They were calculated moves in a game that had started a generation ago. Her father's journal wasn't just a historical document, it was a loaded gun, and she had no idea who to point it at, or whether firing it would bring justice or just get them both killed. Mary sat in her room until dawn, the journal open before her, trying to decide what to do with this terrible knowledge. Part of her wanted to burn it, destroy this dangerous artifact, and pretend she'd never found it. Maybe convince the Duke to elope somewhere far from England, where they could start fresh and forget all this madness. But another part, the part that was her father's daughter, refused to let his sacrifice be meaningless. He died trying to expose corruption, trying to create a more honest world. Could she really just walk away from that unfinished work? The conflict tore at her with physical force, making her stomach clench and her head throb. She thought about the Duke, about his integrity and his courage, about how he'd already defied society for her. Would telling him about the journal put him in more danger, or would hiding it betray the honesty that defined their connection? The codes her father had documented, the names he'd listed, the financial trails he'd mapped, all of it could be weaponized, but against whom and at what cost? As gray morning light crept through her window, Mary realized she couldn't make this decision alone. Some mysteries demanded partners. Some battles required allies. When she sent word asking the Duke to meet her urgently, he arrived within the hour, his face etched with concern. She'd never summoned him before. Their meetings had always been carefully planned, properly chaperoned, socially acceptable. This breach of protocol told him something was seriously wrong. Mary led him to the small parlor where they could speak privately, her aunt stationed just outside the door to maintain the bare minimum of propriety. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, this man who'd chosen her despite every reason not to, who'd risked his reputation and family harmony for something as intangible as genuine connection. Could she trust him with this? The answer, she realized, had never really been in doubt. She trusted him with her heart. Surely that was more valuable than her father's secrets. So she handed him the journal without preamble and said quietly, "This belonged to my father. I think it's why they destroyed him. And I think it might destroy us, too, if we're not careful." The Duke took the leather-bound book, its weight somehow heavy with more than just paper and ink. As he began to read, his expression shifted from curiosity to shock to cold, focused anger. When he finally looked up, his eyes met hers with new understanding, and she saw in them the reflection of her own determination. They were in this together now, for better or worse. Partners in a dangerous game neither had asked to play, but both were too stubborn to forfeit. You know what's interesting about discovering corruption? It's not the shock of learning that powerful people do terrible things. History's already taught us that lesson 1,000 times over. No, the real surprise is realizing how many people know about it and choose silence over justice, comfort over courage. The Duke spent 3 days locked in his study, cross-referencing his father's old business records with the names and transactions documented in Mary's father's journal. What he found made his blood run cold. His father had been planning to testify, to stand publicly alongside Lord Edmund and expose the entire conspiracy. But 2 weeks before the planned revelation, the old Duke had died suddenly, officially of heart failure, though the timing now seemed impossibly convenient. The Duke remembered that period vividly, the confusion and grief of losing his father just as he was preparing to leave for military service. He'd been too young, too overwhelmed to question the circumstances. Now, reading between the lines of these old documents, he saw patterns he'd missed before, vestiges of a cover-up that had successfully masqueraded as natural death. His father had been murdered. The certainty of it settled in his chest like a stone. The conspiracy wasn't just vast, it was meticulously organized, operating like a shadow government within the actual government. At least 15 families were involved, including some the Duke considered friends, people he'd trusted his entire life. They'd created an elaborate system for manipulating everything from agricultural prices to textile imports, ensuring wealth flowed consistently toward their coffers, while smaller merchants and farmers bore the losses. It was brilliant in its cruelty, hidden in plain sight behind the legitimate face of aristocratic business dealings. Lord Edmund's journal contained codes that decoded their communication system. Innocent-seeming letters about hunting parties and social engagements that actually coordinated their market manipulations. The hunt is excellent in October meant they'd target grain markets in autumn. Lady Catherine's roses bloom early this year signaled a planned disruption in the textile trade. The Duke felt sick reading these revelations, understanding that the prosperity he'd always taken for granted was built partially on this systematic theft. Even his own estate's wealth wasn't entirely clean. His father had been involved in some of these schemes before developing a conscience and deciding to expose them all. Now, here's where things got complicated, because Mary and the Duke faced an impossible choice. They could go public with the evidence, try to bring these powerful families to justice. But who would they report to? The magistrates, the judges, the politicians were all either part of the conspiracy or dependent on those who were. Going through official channels would be like asking criminals to arrest themselves. Plus, they had no guarantee they'd survive long enough to present their case. The conspirators had already killed at least 2 people to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to add 2 more bodies to that count. The alternative was almost worse. Do nothing, burn the journal, pretend ignorance, and live their lives in the comfortable silence that everyone else had chosen. They could marry, retreat to one of the Duke's country estates, and simply opt out of this entire mess. It's what any reasonable person would do when facing overwhelming odds and mortal danger. But both Mary and the Duke knew that choice would poison everything between them, that they'd spend their lives wondering if their love was real or just a coward's refuge from responsibility. The revelation came from an unexpected source. The Duke's elderly steward, Thompson, who'd served the family for 40 years, requested a private audience. His weathered face was grave as he spoke. "I know what you found, Your Grace. I was there when your father and Lord Edmund made their plans." He'd been keeping his own records all these years, additional documentation that corroborated everything in the journal and added crucial new details. Thompson had witnessed the night the old Duke was poisoned. Yes, poisoned, not heart failure, and had been too frightened to speak up at the time. "I was a coward," he admitted, his voice breaking, "and I've lived with that shame every day since. But I kept the evidence, just in case someone brave enough came along to use it." He produced a metal box containing letters, financial records, even a vial of the substance used to kill the Duke's father. The old steward had become a secret archivist of evil, preserving the proof while lacking the courage to deploy it. His confession was both gift and burden. Now Mary and the Duke had even more evidence, making them even more dangerous to the conspirators, and therefore even more at risk. The conflict intensified when they discovered they weren't the only ones hunting for these secrets. A series of break-ins occurred, first at Mary's townhouse, then at the Duke's London residence. Nothing valuable was stolen in the conventional sense. Only papers were rifled through, desk drawers forced open. The message was clear. They're looking for the journal and its companion documents. Mary and the Duke had anticipated this possibility and hidden everything in a place no one would think to search, inside the tomb of the Duke's grandmother in the family chapel, sealed behind a false panel Thompson had installed. It was morbid but effective, playing on the superstition that made most people reluctant to disturb burial sites. Still, the break-ins represented an escalation, a shift from subtle warnings to direct action. Someone was getting desperate, which made them more dangerous. The Duke hired private security, former soldiers he'd served with, men whose loyalty he trusted absolutely. They transformed his London house into a fortress, with guards posted at every entrance and no visitor admitted without thorough vetting. It was an extreme response, but given that they were essentially at war with the most powerful families in England, it seemed proportionate rather than paranoid. Mary found herself living in a state of constant vigilance that was exhausting beyond measure. Every footstep in the hallway made her jump. Every letter that arrived might contain a threat. Every social engagement could be a trap. She stopped attending public events entirely, which only fueled more gossip about her supposedly manipulative hold over the Duke. The rumors now painted her as everything from a foreign spy to a practitioner of dark arts, when the truth was far simpler and somehow more radical. She was just a woman who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged, even when challenging it might cost her everything. The isolation wore on her spirit. She'd gone from being invisible to being infamous, and neither state allowed her to simply be herself. Late at night, she'd take out her father's journal and reread his entries, drawing strength from his courage. He'd known the risks and proceeded anyway, believing that some truths were worth dying for. Was she prepared to make that same sacrifice? And more troubling, was she prepared to ask the Duke to make it alongside her? The weight of that responsibility sometimes felt crushing. The Duke, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation, trying to identify which members of the conspiracy might be vulnerable to pressure, who might be convinced to testify if offered protection and immunity. He discovered something fascinating. Several of the conspirators' sons and daughters had no idea about their parents' activities. They were good people, honest people, who would be horrified to learn what their families had done. This created a possible strategy: expose the conspiracy in a way that divided families, that made younger generations question their inheritance and allegiances. It was psychological warfare, and it felt distasteful, but this whole situation had long passed the point of clean solutions. He identified 3 young lords whose integrity he trusted, men who'd served in the military with him and whose character had been tested under fire. If he could convince them to investigate their own families, provide them with targeted information that would lead them to discover the truth independently, it might work. It was risky. Any one of them could betray him, run straight to their fathers, and expose his entire plan. But doing nothing was riskier still, and at least this approach felt proactive rather than just waiting for the next threat to materialize. What neither Mary nor the Duke fully understood yet, what Thompson's confession had hinted at but not fully explained, was that the conspiracy had fractures within it, competing factions with different goals and different tolerance for violence. Some members just wanted to maintain their wealth and were horrified by the murders. Others viewed killing as necessary business expense, no more significant than paying a tradesman. This internal division would prove to be their greatest vulnerability, the crack through which light might finally penetrate. But identifying and exploiting that weakness would require navigating a labyrinth of lies, half-truths, and carefully maintained secrets, each step forward potentially triggering a trap that could destroy them both. The game was entering its most dangerous phase, where one wrong move meant death, and the right moves were increasingly hard to distinguish from the wrong ones. And somewhere in the shadows, watching their every action, the true architects of this conspiracy waited with the patience of predators who'd already survived multiple threats to their power. There's a peculiar kind of loneliness that comes with knowing dangerous truths. You become isolated not by distance, but by the weight of secrets you can't share. Mary and the Duke existed now in a bubble separate from the rest of society, going through the motions of normal life while planning something that could either revolutionize their world or get them killed. They attended carefully selected social functions to maintain appearances, dancing and smiling, while silently cataloging who watched them too closely, who asked questions that seemed innocent but weren't. It was exhausting theater, this performance of normalcy layered over a foundation of conspiracy and danger. Mary had learned to read rooms the way her father must have, identifying allies and enemies through subtle cues, a too-long glance, a conversation that stopped abruptly when she approached, laughter that felt forced. The enigma was figuring out who knew what, and whether those who knew were threats or potential converts to their cause. Every interaction became a chess move, every word carefully chosen for multiple audiences. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source: Lady Victoria Ashford, the woman everyone had assumed the Duke would marry. She requested a private meeting with Mary, a proposition so bold and unexpected that Mary's first instinct was to refuse. It had to be a trap. But something in the wording of Victoria's note suggested genuine urgency rather than malicious intent. They met in a church, neutral ground, where they could speak without drawing attention, sitting in a back pew while afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows. Victoria didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My father is part of something terrible, and I think you know what it is." Her voice shook, but her eyes were steady. She'd found correspondence in her father's study, letters that used the coded language Mary and the Duke had learned to recognize. Victoria wasn't stupid. She'd started decoding them herself, horrified by what she discovered. "I thought perhaps he was just involved in typical aristocratic schemes," she said, "the kind of corner-cutting all wealthy families engage in. But this is different. This is theft and murder dressed up as business." She looked at Mary with a mixture of respect and envy. "You're trying to stop them, aren't you? You and the Duke?" Now, Mary had to make a split-second decision about whether to trust this woman who'd been positioned as her rival, whose own father was one of the conspirators they were trying to expose. It could be an elaborate setup, Victoria acting as bait to extract confirmation of what they knew. But Mary had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts said Victoria was genuine. She had the look of someone who'd recently had their worldview shattered and was still picking through the rubble. So Mary told her a carefully edited version of the truth, enough to confirm Victoria's suspicions without revealing everything. Victoria's relief was palpable. "I thought I was going mad," she whispered, "imagining monsters where there were just my parents and their friends." She offered to spy for them, to document her father's activities and provide advance warning of any actions planned against Mary or the Duke. It was dangerous for her, potentially catastrophic if discovered, but she insisted. "I won't be complicit in this silence anymore," Victoria said firmly. "If my father is a criminal, he needs to face consequences, even if it destroys our family's name." Mary felt a surge of admiration for this woman she'd been taught to view as an enemy. Sometimes courage appeared in unexpected packages. The revelation of Victoria as an ally shifted their strategy significantly. Now they had someone inside the conspiracy, though Victoria's access was limited by her gender. The men discussed business away from their daughters and wives, maintaining the fiction that their crimes were just boring finance. Still, she could observe patterns, note when her father seemed stressed or when unusual meetings were scheduled. She became their early warning system, and more than once her information prevented Mary or the Duke from walking into situations that could have ended badly. But Victoria brought something else too, a moral complexity that forced them to confront uncomfortable questions. Many of the conspirators had families who'd benefit from the status quo, children whose futures depended on maintaining their parents' wealth and position. Exposing the conspiracy wouldn't just punish the guilty, it would devastate innocents too. Victoria's younger brother was 12, totally oblivious to his father's crimes. What would happen to him when the family name was destroyed? These weren't abstract concerns. They were real people who'd suffer for sins they hadn't committed. Mary found herself lying awake at night, wrestling with whether justice was worth that collateral damage. The Duke was more pragmatic, or perhaps just more willing to accept difficult truths. "Innocent people are already suffering," he pointed out during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "The farmers whose crops are undervalued, the merchants driven to bankruptcy, the families whose children go hungry because these men manipulate food prices for profit. Victoria's brother might lose his social standing, but he won't starve. That's more than can be said for the victims of this conspiracy." It was a harsh calculation, the kind of moral arithmetic that war had taught him to perform. Mary understood his logic, but couldn't quite embrace it with his certainty. She kept thinking about her own childhood, about what it had felt like to lose everything through no fault of her own. Wouldn't they be inflicting that same trauma on other children? The conflict wasn't between good and evil anymore. Those lines were clear enough. The conflict was between justice and mercy, between the collective good and individual innocence, between the world as it was and the world as it should be. These were the kinds of choices that left scars regardless of which option you chose. Things escalated when one of the conspirators, Lord Pemberton, whose pomposity Mary had publicly challenged months ago, died under mysterious circumstances. The official story was suicide, despondent over gambling debts. But Mary and the Duke knew better. He'd been eliminated by his own associates, probably for being a weak link, someone whose guilty conscience or loose lips posed a risk. It was a message, though whether directed at them or at other wavering conspirators wasn't entirely clear. What was clear was that the stakes had risen. They weren't just fighting against corruption anymore. They were caught in a web where the conspirators were turning on each other, paranoid and vicious. The Duke increased security again, essentially making Mary a prisoner in his home for her own protection. She'd moved there under the guise of his elderly aunt serving as chaperone, maintaining barely credible propriety. The walls were closing in from all directions. Time was running out for multiple reasons. The conspirators were getting more desperate and dangerous. The evidence they'd gathered was becoming known to too many people, and society's patience with their unconventional relationship was wearing thin. They needed to act soon, but acting prematurely could be fatal. The plan they finally devised was audacious to the point of madness, which was probably why it had a chance of working. Rather than trying to work through official channels or expose everything at once, they'd create a cascade of revelations using Victoria's access to plant documents where they'd be discovered by other family members who didn't know about the conspiracy. They'd simultaneously approach the three young lords the Duke had identified, providing them with pieces of the puzzle that would lead them to investigate their own families. The goal was to create an internal crisis within the conspiracy itself, fracturing it from the inside until the whole rotten structure collapsed under its own weight. It required precise timing and a bit of luck, multiple moving parts that all needed to work together. Thompson would ensure certain documents accidentally surfaced during routine estate management. Victoria would orchestrate discoveries within her own family and others. Mary and the Duke would be ready to provide evidence to the authorities the moment enough conspirators had turned on each other to make official action possible. It was complex, fragile, and dependent on dozens of people making the choices they hoped they'd make. What they couldn't predict, what no amount of planning could prepare them for, was how personal this would become. The night before they set their plan in motion, Mary received a final letter, not threatening this time, but pleading. It was from the widow of Lord Pemberton, the man who'd been suicided by the conspiracy. She knew the truth about her husband's death and wanted revenge, wanted the monsters who'd killed him to face justice. But she also begged Mary to consider mercy, to find a way to expose the crimes without destroying every family involved. "My children have already lost their father," she wrote in shaking script. "Please don't take their future too." It was heartbreaking, and it crystallized the impossible position Mary found herself in. There was no clean solution here, no way to punish the guilty without harming the innocent, no path to justice that didn't require sacrifices from people who'd already sacrificed too much. She showed the letter to the Duke, and they sat in silence for a long time, holding hands while contemplating the weight of what they were about to do. Tomorrow, they'd trigger events that couldn't be undone, that would reshape dozens of lives, and possibly cost them their own. The mystery wasn't what would happen. They'd planned for that. The mystery was whether they'd be able to live with themselves afterward, whether the price of justice would prove too high even for people willing to pay it. In the stillness of that moment before the storm, Mary understood something her father had probably learned too late. Some secrets destroy you whether you keep them or reveal them, and the only real choice is which kind of destruction you can best survive. You know what they say about the moment before battle? Time stretches and compresses simultaneously, hours feeling like minutes, while seconds drag into eternity. The morning they initiated their plan, Mary woke before dawn, unable to sleep, her mind racing through all the variables they'd tried to control and all the chaos they couldn't predict. The Duke was already awake too, standing by the window watching London emerge from darkness, his silhouette sharp against the gradually lightening sky. They didn't speak much. What was there to say that hadn't already been said 100 times? Instead, they simply existed together in that pregnant silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. By noon, Thompson would discover the first set of documents during a routine audit. By evening, Victoria would ensure her father found correspondence that implicated his closest allies. Within days, the three young lords would receive anonymous packages containing evidence of their family's crimes. It was all in motion now, unstoppable as an avalanche, and all Mary and the Duke could do was watch it unfold and hope they'd calculated correctly. The enigma of human nature, how people would react when confronted with uncomfortable truths, was about to be tested on a scale they could barely comprehend. The first crack appeared faster than expected. Lord Ashford, Victoria's father, confronted one of his co-conspirators that very evening, accusing him of keeping secrets and putting everyone at risk. The argument was loud enough that servants heard it, and servants talk. Within hours, whispers were circulating through London's social networks about a falling out among the aristocracy's elite. The conspiracy's greatest strength had always been unity, absolute trust among its members that everyone would maintain the silence. But now that trust was fracturing, suspicion spreading like poison through their ranks. Who'd leaked information? Who couldn't be trusted anymore? The paranoia Mary and the Duke had hoped to cultivate took root faster than they dared imagine. By the second day, two more conspirators had public disagreements, each accusing the other of being the source of their troubles. They were turning on each other just as planned, but with a viciousness that was almost frightening to witness. These were people who'd worked together for decades, and now they were tearing each other apart, the vestiges of their alliance crumbling into recrimination and rage. It was working, but watching it unfold felt like standing too close to a wildfire you'd intentionally set. Now here's where things got complicated in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. The three young lords they'd approached reacted differently than expected. Lord Rothschild, whose integrity the Duke had trusted absolutely, took the evidence straight to his father, choosing family loyalty over abstract justice. It was a betrayal that stung, though in hindsight, perhaps they should have seen it coming. Blood runs deeper than friendship, especially in aristocratic families where lineage is everything. Fortunately, Rothschild's father wasn't one of the conspiracy's architects. He was mid-level, involved but not essential. The exposure there would be damaging but not catastrophic. Lord Pemberton's son, cousin to the man who'd been murdered, responded exactly as hoped, horrified by his uncle's death and his family's involvement. He gathered additional evidence and prepared to testify before magistrates, providing the insider testimony they desperately needed. The third Lord, Hastings, surprised everyone by doing something neither predicted. He went public immediately, writing an open letter to the Times newspaper exposing his own father's crimes and calling for investigation of the entire network. It was nuclear, devastating, and exactly the kind of bold move they'd needed but hadn't dared request. Hastings was young, idealistic, and apparently so disgusted by what he'd discovered that he didn't care about the consequences for himself or his family. The revelation that hit the newspapers triggered an explosion of public interest and official scrutiny. Suddenly, the conspiracy couldn't be ignored or quietly managed. It was front-page news, with citizens demanding answers and politicians scrambling to distance themselves from anyone involved. The magistrates, who might have been inclined to protect the aristocracy, found themselves under too much public pressure to cover things up. Investigations were launched, arrests made, and the entire social structure of London's elite began to wobble. Mary and the Duke watched from a careful distance as everything they'd worked toward materialized, feeling a mixture of triumph and horror. They'd succeeded in exposing the conspiracy, but the cost was becoming apparent. Families were being destroyed, children learning their parents were criminals, fortunes evaporating as assets were frozen. Lady Pemberton's plea echoed in Mary's mind. All those innocent people caught in the blast radius of justice. Victoria's younger brother had to be withdrawn from school after other children started taunting him about his father being a thief. These were the consequences they'd known would come, but hadn't quite prepared themselves to witness up close. The conflict reached its peak when several of the conspirators attempted to flee the country, prompting manhunts and even more scandalous headlines. Two were caught at the docks trying to board ships to France. Another made it as far as Scotland before being arrested. The desperation was palpable. These once powerful men reduced to fugitives scrambling for escape. But the most shocking moment came when Lord Ashford, Victoria's father, did something unexpectedly honorable. He turned himself in and offered to testify against the conspiracy's true architects in exchange for lenient treatment of the lower-level participants. It was a calculated move, certainly, but also one that suggested some remnant of conscience still existed beneath the corruption. Victoria was devastated, watching her father led away in chains, but also quietly relieved that he'd chosen confession over flight. She'd gambled everything on the belief that people were capable of redemption, and her father had partially validated that faith. The mystery of human nature proved deeper than simple categories of good and evil. People were capable of terrible things and noble gestures, sometimes within the same hour. As the trials began, Mary and the Duke found themselves in an unexpected position. They were heroes to some, villains to others, and oddly invisible to the rest. The public credited Hastings and young Pemberton with exposing the conspiracy, while Mary and the Duke's role remained largely secret, which was exactly how they'd planned it. They didn't want fame or recognition. They wanted justice and the freedom to live their lives without constantly looking over their shoulders. The trials lasted months, with testimony revealing depths of corruption that shocked even Mary and the Duke, who'd thought they understood the full scope. The conspiracy had influenced everything from military contracts to agricultural policy, had bribed judges and blackmailed politicians, had essentially run a shadow government for 2 decades. Lord Edmund and the old Duke had been killed for threatening to expose just a fraction of it. The full truth was far worse than anyone had imagined, and it triggered reforms that would reshape English society for generations. New laws were passed, oversight committees established, and the automatic trust afforded to aristocratic families was permanently damaged. It was revolution by revelation, transformation through transparency. And it had all started because one woman without a dowry refused to accept silence. The aftermath was strange, almost anticlimactic. After months of danger and intensity, Mary and the Duke found themselves in a world where they could simply be together without conspiracy, shadowing their every move. They married quietly, with only close friends present. Victoria served as Mary's witness, a fitting symbol of how former rivals had become allies through shared purpose. The wedding was nothing like the grand society affair it might have been, but it was real, honest, stripped of performance and pretense. They spent their honeymoon at one of the Duke's country estates, far from London's chaos, walking through gardens and talking about everything except conspiracies and corruption. It felt almost surreal, this absence of danger, like they'd spent so long in crisis mode that peace felt foreign. Mary would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced some new threat had materialized, only to find the Duke sleeping peacefully beside her, and nothing more sinister than moonlight streaming through the windows. Healing from that kind of sustained trauma took time, and they were patient with themselves and each other. They'd been through something extraordinary, a trial by fire that had forged their connection in ways most couples never experienced. What surprised Mary most was how the experience had changed her understanding of herself. She'd started this journey as someone defined by what she lacked. No dowry, no prospects, no social standing. But she'd ended it as someone defined by what she possessed: courage, integrity, intelligence, and a willingness to fight for what mattered despite overwhelming odds. The Duke had fallen in love with her not despite her circumstances, but because those circumstances had shaped someone extraordinary. And she'd learned that her father's greatest gift hadn't been the fortune he'd lost or the journal he'd left behind. It had been the example he'd set, the demonstration that some principles were worth dying for. She visited his grave often, telling him about everything that had happened, about how his secrets had finally been revealed and justice finally served. She liked to imagine he could hear her, that somewhere he knew his death hadn't been meaningless. The vestiges of his courage lived on in her, and she'd passed his legacy forward in ways he could never have anticipated. The forbidden truths he'd tried to expose were now public knowledge, the hidden mechanisms of corruption now visible to everyone. It wasn't a perfect victory. Those innocent families had still suffered, and not everyone guilty had faced appropriate consequences. But it was something, a meaningful change in a world that desperately needed changing. And sometimes, Mary reflected, something is all we can hope for when fighting against overwhelming darkness. A small light, a crack in the wall, a beginning rather than an ending. So here's the question that really matters. What are you going to do with this knowledge? You've just witnessed Mary's transformation from invisible to unforgettable, seen how she dismantled a conspiracy that had controlled entire generations, watched her refuse to accept the limitations society placed on her worth. But this isn't just her story. It's a mirror reflecting your own life back at you. What lies have you accepted as truth? What limitations have you internalized without questioning their legitimacy? Where in your life are you playing by rules designed to keep you exactly where you are, convinced you need something external, a dowry, a degree, a certain amount of money, someone else's approval, before you're allowed to pursue what you actually want? The uncomfortable revelation here is that most of us are living Mary's early life, not her later one. We're accepting the whispered judgments, staying silent when we should speak, hiding our true capabilities because showing them might threaten people who benefit from our smallness. What secrets are you keeping that need to be revealed? What hidden parts of yourself have you buried because they don't fit the acceptable narrative? Here's what I want you to understand. The conspiracy against you isn't always as dramatic as the one Mary faced, but it's just as real. It's in every voice that told you to be realistic, every system that made you feel inadequate, every moment you chose comfort over courage because the cost of truth seemed too high. Think about the conflicts in your own life right now, the ones you've been avoiding, the conversations you haven't had, the dreams you've shelved because they seemed impossible. What would change if you approached them with Mary's determination, if you stopped waiting for perfect conditions and started acting with what you have right now? She didn't have money or connections or society's approval, but she had curiosity, courage, and a refusal to accept someone else's definition of her worth. Those things cost nothing except the willingness to be uncomfortable, to risk failure, to potentially lose people who only valued you as long as you stayed small. Are you willing to pay that price? Because here's the mystery nobody wants you to solve. You already have everything you need to transform your life. The Duke didn't fall in love with Mary because she suddenly acquired value. He recognized value that had always been there, but that everyone else was too blind to see. Who in your life is waiting for you to recognize your own worth? What opportunities are you missing because you're convinced you're not ready, not worthy, not enough? Let me be provocative for a moment. You're going to die someday, and when that moment comes, will you be satisfied knowing you played it safe, followed the rules, never made waves, never challenged the comfortable lies that kept you trapped? Or would you rather go out like Mary's father did, fighting for something that mattered, leaving behind vestiges of courage that inspire others long after you're gone. The forbidden truth is that most people choose comfort over significance, choose being liked over being real, choose silence over the messy complications of honesty. They end up with lives that look acceptable from the outside, but feel hollow from within, wondering where all the years went and why nothing ever changed. Is that what you want? Because if it's not, if you're reading this and feeling that uncomfortable stirring that says, "I want more than this," then you need to start making different choices today, right now, not someday when conditions are perfect. Perfect conditions are a myth, a conspiracy designed to keep you waiting forever. Here's your homework, and I'm serious about this. Identify one area of your life where you've been playing by someone else's rules, where you've accepted limitations that were imposed rather than inherent. Maybe it's a career you stayed in because it's practical, even though it drains your soul. Maybe it's a relationship where you've made yourself smaller to avoid conflict. Maybe it's a dream you've been hiding because people might laugh or judge or think you're being unrealistic. Write it down, specifically, honestly, without sugarcoating. Now ask yourself, what would Mary do? Not the Mary from the beginning who tried to fit in, but the Mary who stood in front of a duke and spoke her genuine thoughts, who risked everything to expose corruption, who chose truth over comfort even when the cost was terrifying. What's the first small step you could take toward that kind of authenticity? Not a dramatic revolution necessarily, but a genuine move toward living on your own terms rather than society's. Take that step this week. Not next month, not when you feel ready. This week. Because here's the secret about courage. It doesn't eliminate fear. It just refuses to let fear make the final decision. And let's talk about those codes and patterns you've been conditioned not to see. Mary learned to read the hidden messages in society, to recognize when she was being manipulated or controlled. You need to develop that same skill in your own context. Pay attention to the voices in your head telling you what you can't do, what you shouldn't want, what you're not allowed to become. Where did those voices come from? Are they based on your actual limitations or on someone else's projection, someone else's fear, someone else's need to keep you predictable and manageable? Start questioning everything you've accepted as inevitable. Why do you work the way you do? Why do you spend time with people who don't energize you? Why do you pursue goals that don't actually excite you? The disappearance of your authentic self didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, a slow erosion of genuine desires replaced by acceptable alternatives. But that process can be reversed. Every day you can reclaim a little more of who you actually are beneath all the conditioning and compromise. It starts with noticing, with paying attention, with refusing to accept the comfortable numbness that passes for normal life. Now, I know some of you are thinking this sounds exhausting, that maybe ignorance really is bliss, and perhaps it's better not to see these patterns, not to question these systems, not to rock boats that seem to be floating just fine. And you know what? That's a valid choice. You can absolutely close this video, go back to your life, pretend you didn't hear any of this, and probably be just fine in a conventional sense. But here's what you can't do. You can't unhear it. The enigma has been revealed, the mystery partially solved, and now you know that there's an alternative to accepting whatever limitations others impose on you. That knowledge will sit in the back of your mind, occasionally bubbling up during quiet moments, asking uncomfortable questions at inconvenient times. Because once you've seen how Mary transformed her life by refusing to play by rigged rules, you can't pretend those same rules aren't operating in your own world. The conspiracy of mediocrity, the one that keeps everyone safely comfortable and quietly unfulfilled, has been exposed. What you do with that revelation is entirely up to you, but don't lie to yourself about the choice you're making. Choosing safety is still a choice. And it comes with its own costs that you'll pay over decades of quiet regret. So here's my challenge to you, and this is where we separate people who consume content from people who transform their lives. Apply what you've learned here, not abstractly, not theoretically, but practically and specifically. Take the lessons from Mary's story and map them onto your reality. Where do you need more courage? Where do you need to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable? Where do you need to stop waiting for permission and start acting on your own authority? And most importantly, who do you need to become in order to live the life you actually want, rather than the life you've been told to want? These aren't rhetorical questions. I want you to answer them, write them down, treat them as seriously as Mary treated her father's journal. Because your life contains secrets too, hidden truths about who you really are and what you're actually capable of. And those truths deserve to be revealed and honored. The world doesn't need more people playing small, following scripts, accepting comfortable lies. It needs people like Mary, like the Duke, like Victoria, people willing to risk comfort for authenticity, safety for significance, approval for integrity. Are you one of those people? Or are you going to let this moment pass, let these ideas fade, return to the same patterns that were slowly suffocating your spirit before you clicked on this video? The choice, as always, is yours. But choose consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of what you're accepting and what you're rejecting. That's the real power Mary discovered. Not the power to change everything instantly, but the power to choose consciously rather than drifting through life on autopilot following someone else's programming. If this story resonated with you, if you felt something shift while watching, if you're ready to stop accepting limitations and start creating transformation, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because Mary's story is just the beginning. There are dozens more tales like this. Stories of people who refused to accept society's verdict on their worth, who uncovered conspiracies designed to keep them small, who transformed their lives by simply deciding that truth mattered more than comfort. Each week, we dive deep into these forbidden narratives, these hidden patterns, these mysteries that reveal how the game actually works beneath its polished surface. This isn't surface-level content designed to make you feel good temporarily. This is deep knowledge, the kind that actually changes lives if you're willing to apply it. So subscribe, stay connected, and commit to your own transformation. Because the real question isn't whether Mary's story is inspiring. It's whether you're brave enough to write your own version of it. Let's find out together.